A young black boy helped a millionaire fix a flat tire without expecting anything in return. The next day, a black SUV showed up in front of his house, and what happened next touched the entire neighborhood. The sleek black SUV cut through the morning mist like a knife, its polished surface reflecting the scattered rays of the rising sun. Behind the wheel, Michael Thompson's manicured fingers drummed an impatient rhythm against the leather steering wheel. His Rolex caught the light, a constant reminder of the time he was losing. 30 minutes, he muttered, glancing at the dashboard clock. 30 minutes to close the biggest deal of the quarter. The rural road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by towering oaks whose shadows danced across his path. Michael had taken this shortcut on his assistant's recommendation, a decision he was beginning to regret. The isolation of the countryside made him uneasy, so different from the steel and glass canyons of downtown where he usually operated. The first sign that something was wrong came with a subtle vibration in the steering wheel. Then, a sound that made his heart sink, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of a flat tire. No, no, no. Michael eased the vehicle onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the wheels. The morning air hit him like a wall as he stepped out, the humidity already thick despite the early hour. His Italian suit, perfectly tailored for boardroom battles, felt suffocating in the rural heat. The rear tire was beyond salvation, shredded rubber peeling away from the rim like dead skin. Michael reached for his phone, only to be greeted by the dreaded, no signal message. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. Perfect. Just perfect. As he stood there, memories he'd long suppressed began to surface. 20 years ago, he'd been in a similar situation, young, broke, stranded. He remembered the countless cars that passed him by, their drivers averting their eyes. That day had taught him a harsh lesson about the world, one that had shaped his rise to success. Rely on no one but yourself. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled him from his reverie. Through the morning haze, a figure approached, small, determined. As it drew closer, Michael tensed, his hand instinctively moving to protect his wallet. But it was just a boy, no more than 14, wearing worn jeans and a faded t-shirt that had seen better days. Despite his shabby appearance, there was something in his eyes, a quiet confidence that made Michael pause. "Car trouble, sir?" The boy's voice was clear, lacking the usual teenage awkwardness. Michael hesitated, years of cultivated distrust warring with his desperate situation. "Flat tire," he finally admitted, gesturing to the ruined wheel. The boy, James, though Michael didn't know it yet, moved closer, studying the damage with practiced eyes. "I can fix that for you," he said simply, as if offering to tie a shoelace. Michael's eyebrows shot up. "You? No offense, kid, but this is a $90,000 vehicle." James just smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something Michael didn't. "My dad was a mechanic before he passed. Taught me everything he knew." There was a flash of something in his eyes, pride mixed with old pain, that made Michael's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Got a spare?" James asked, already moving toward the back of the SUV. Before Michael could protest, the boy had opened the trunk and located the spare tire and jack with practiced ease. His movements were sure, efficient, nothing like the awkward fumbling Michael would have expected. As James worked, Michael found himself studying the boy. Despite the heat and the dirty work, there wasn't a single complaint. Instead, James hummed softly, occasionally explaining what he was doing in a way that made Michael feel both educated and slightly embarrassed about his own ignorance. "You know," James said as he tightened the last lug nut, "my dad used to say that cars are like people. Sometimes they break down, and that's okay. What matters is having someone there to help you back up." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. When was the last time anyone had helped him without expecting something in return? As James finished, Michael reached for his wallet, pulling out several $100 bills. "Here," he said, extending the money, "for your trouble." But James stepped back, shaking his head. "Keep it, sir. I didn't help for money." "Everyone wants something," Michael insisted, the bills still extended. James's smile turned sad, wise beyond his years. "My dad also taught me that sometimes the best payment is just knowing you helped someone who needed it." He started walking away, then turned back. "Take care, sir. Drive safe." Michael stood there, money still in hand, watching as James disappeared down the road. Something uncomfortable stirred in his chest. Not quite guilt, not quite admiration, but a strange mixture of both. As he climbed back into his SUV, Michael caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The deal he'd been rushing to close suddenly seemed less important, the numbers that had consumed his thoughts fading against the memory of a boy's simple kindness. He started the engine, but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, he sat there, listening to the idle purr, his mind racing. Who was that boy? Why had his help, freely given, shaken Michael's carefully constructed worldview so thoroughly? The answer wouldn't come that day, but as Michael finally pulled back onto the road, he knew one thing with certainty. His life had just changed course, and that boy, whoever he was, had just set something in motion that would alter everything Michael thought he knew about success, wealth, and what truly matters in life. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he believed in and lead him to discover the true meaning of wealth, one that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. That night, sleep eluded Michael Thompson. He tossed and turned in his king-sized bed, Egyptian cotton sheets tangled around him like chains. The boy's face kept appearing in his mind, that knowing smile, those old eyes in a young face. His wife, Rebecca, stirred beside him. "Another merger keeping you up?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "No," Michael replied, staring at the ceiling. "Something different." Rebecca rolled over, already drifting back to sleep, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. Their relationship had become like this, parallel lines that never quite intersected, sharing a bed but little else. As dawn approached, Michael found himself in his home office, doing something he hadn't done in years, questioning himself. The computer screen glowed softly as he pulled up his banking records. Numbers scrolled past, investments, acquisitions, profits, all the things he'd spent his life accumulating. "What's it all for?" he whispered to the empty room. The morning brought no clarity, but it did bring determination. Michael called his assistant, canceling his meetings for the day, something he hadn't done in 5 years. He ignored her startled protests and the board members' urgent messages. Instead, he found himself driving back to that rural road, this time in casual clothes rather than his usual armor of tailored suits. The morning was clearer than yesterday, the mist having given way to brilliant sunshine that seemed to mock his internal turmoil. He drove slowly, scanning the landscape. Houses were scattered along the road, most showing signs of wear and age. Then he saw it, a small, weathered house set back from the road. A familiar figure was in the yard, attempting to fix what appeared to be an ancient lawnmower. Michael pulled over, his heart pounding unexpectedly. As he approached, James looked up, recognition lighting his features. "Hey, mister. Tire holding up okay?" But before Michael could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "James Carter, what have I told you about talking to strangers?" A woman emerged from the house, her face lined with worry and years of hardship. She moved protectively toward James, and Michael suddenly realized how he must look, an unknown man approaching a young boy. "Mom, it's okay," James said quickly. "This is the man I helped yesterday, the one with the flat tire." Sarah Carter's stance softened slightly, but wariness remained in her eyes. "Is there something we can help you with, mister?" "Thompson. Michael Thompson." He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. I wanted to thank your son properly for his help yesterday." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "James told me you offered him money." "We don't need charity, Mr. Thompson." The words stung, but something in her pride resonated with Michael. "It's not charity," he found himself saying. "Your son, he taught me something yesterday, something important." James looked between his mother and Michael, curiosity bright in his eyes. Sarah studied Michael for a long moment before her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Thompson? It's not fancy, but it's hot." The invitation surprised them both. Michael nodded, following them into the house. The interior was clean but sparse, with mismatched furniture that spoke of years of making do. Yet there was something else here, something that had been missing from Michael's mansion: warmth. As Sarah prepared coffee in the small kitchen, James chatted about school, his dreams of becoming an engineer, and his father who had passed away 2 years ago in a construction accident. Each word painted a picture of a life so different from Michael's own, yet somehow more real. "Your father taught you well," Michael said softly, watching James help his mother with practiced ease. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes: pain, pride, and perhaps a hint of fear. "He did what he could," she said. "We manage." But Michael could see the strain beneath her brave words. The roof needed repairs, the windows were drafty, and the plumbing made ominous sounds. This house was holding together through sheer determination, much like its occupants. As they talked, Michael felt something shift inside him. The urge to throw money at the situation and walk away faded, replaced by a deeper desire to truly help, to make a real difference. But before he could voice these thoughts, James asked a question that stopped him cold. "Mr. Thompson, why did you really come back? Nobody ever comes back." The simple question cut through all of Michael's carefully constructed defenses. In that moment, looking into James's earnest face and Sarah's cautious eyes, he found himself telling the truth. "Because yesterday was the first time in 20 years that someone helped me without wanting anything in return, and it made me realize I've forgotten how to do that myself." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Sarah's hand found James's shoulder, squeezing gently. And in that simple gesture, Michael saw everything he'd been missing: connection, genuine human contact, the simple joy of being there for others. But as he opened his mouth to say more, a phone call shattered the moment. It was his assistant, panic in her voice. The deal he'd missed yesterday was falling apart. The board was calling an emergency meeting. Reality came crashing back, and Michael stood abruptly. "I have to go," he said, already moving toward the door. "But I'll be back. I promise." As he drove away, he caught a glimpse of James and Sarah in his rearview mirror, standing on their worn porch. Something inside him knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a story that would change not just their lives, but his own. What he didn't know was that his promise to return would be tested sooner than he expected, and that the simple act of keeping it would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the true meaning of wealth. The emergency board meeting was a blur of accusations and demands. Michael sat at the head of the conference table, his mind elsewhere as his fellow board members argued about the failed deal. "Thompson, are you even listening?" Richard Blake, his longest-serving board member, snapped. "This could cost us millions." Michael looked up, seeing the room with new eyes. Expensive suits, designer watches, faces aged by stress and greed. Was this what he'd spent his life pursuing? "Let it go," Michael said quietly. "What?" Richard sputtered. "I said, let it go." Michael stood, straightening his jacket. "There will be other deals." Leaving his stunned colleagues behind, Michael drove straight back to the Carter house. This time, he wasn't alone. Tom Wilson, his most trusted construction foreman, sat in the passenger seat, reviewing the notes Michael had made about the house's condition. "Boss," Tom said carefully, "I get that you want to help, but this is different from our usual projects." Michael smiled slightly. "Different is exactly what I need right now, Tom." They pulled up to the house just as Sarah was returning from her shift at the local diner, still wearing her waitress uniform. Her eyes widened at the sight of the two men. "Mr. Thompson? I didn't expect—" "Please, call me Michael," he interrupted, then gestured to Tom. "This is Tom Wilson, the best construction manager I know. I'd like him to take a look at your house, if that's okay." Sarah's pride flared immediately. "I told you, we don't need dash." "Mom!" James came running from inside, excitement radiating from him. "Did you see? Mr. Thompson came back. He kept his promise." The joy in James's voice seemed to soften Sarah's resistance. She looked at her son, then back at Michael, studying him with those careful eyes. "Why?" she asked simply. Michael took a deep breath. "Because yesterday, your son showed me something I'd forgotten. And today, I want to show him something too. That promises matter, that people can surprise you in good ways. A long moment passed before Sarah nodded slowly. All right, you can look. What followed was a thorough inspection that revealed more problems than even Michael had anticipated. The foundation needed reinforcement, the electrical wiring was dangerously outdated, and the plumbing system was on its last legs. As Tom listed the issues, Michael watched Sarah's face grow increasingly pale. James, however, followed Tom around with fascination, asking detailed questions about each problem and potential solution. The kid's got a good head on his shoulders, Tom remarked quietly to Michael. Reminds me of someone. Michael raised an eyebrow. Who? You. Before all this. Tom gestured vaguely at Michael's expensive clothes. Back when you cared about building things, not just buying them. The words hit home harder than Michael expected. He remembered his early days in construction, the satisfaction of creating something real, tangible. When had he lost that? Sarah, Michael called, making a decision. I'd like to help fix your house. Not as charity, he added quickly, seeing her expression. Consider it an investment in James's future. What do you mean? Sarah asked warily. Your son wants to be an engineer. Let this be his first project. He can work with Tom, learn the practical side of construction. It's valuable experience. James's eyes lit up. Really? Mom, can I? Please? Sarah looked torn. We can't afford dash. I'm not asking you to pay, Michael interrupted. I'm asking you to trust me, to let me do something that matters. A tense silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, James spoke up. Mom, remember what Dad used to say? Sometimes the biggest gift we can give someone is letting them help us. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She looked at her son, then at Michael, seeing something in his expression that seemed to make up her mind. All right, she whispered. All right. But as plans were being made and Tom was scheduling his crew, none of them noticed the expensive car that drove slowly past the house, or the man inside taking pictures with a telephoto lens. Back in the city, Richard Blake sat in his office, examining those same photos on his computer screen. His thin lips curved into a calculating smile as he picked up his phone. Get me everything you can find on Sarah and James Carter, he ordered. Michael Thompson's sudden interest in them could be useful. The wheels were in motion now, but not all of them were turning toward good intentions. As Michael drove home that evening, filled with plans and purpose, he had no idea that his act of kindness was about to become a battlefield, one where he would have to choose between the empire he'd built and the new path he'd discovered. The real test was just beginning. The transformation began early on a crisp Monday morning. The quiet neighborhood was awakened by the arrival of construction trucks, their diesel engines rumbling as Tom's crew unloaded equipment and materials. The sight drew curious neighbors from their homes, creating an impromptu gathering on the street. James was already outside, practically vibrating with excitement despite the early hour. He wore a brand new hard hat, a gift from Tom, that was slightly too big and kept sliding over his eyes. First rule of construction, Tom said, adjusting the hat with a paternal smile. Safety always comes first. Michael arrived just as the crew was setting up, parking his SUV next to the work trucks. He'd swapped his usual business attire for jeans and a work shirt, earning surprised looks from the workers who'd only ever seen him in suits. Boss, Tom greeted him, eyebrows raised. Didn't expect to see you getting your hands dirty. Some things are worth getting dirty for, Michael replied, rolling up his sleeves. As the work began, something unexpected happened. Instead of merely observing, Michael found himself drawn into the physical labor. He helped carry lumber, held measuring tapes, and learned the basics of construction alongside James. The boy proved to be an eager and quick learner. His questions were sharp, insightful, showing an innate understanding of engineering principles that impressed even the veteran workers. But it was his enthusiasm that truly transformed the work site. Mr. Thompson, look, James called out, proudly showing Michael how he'd learned to use a level. It's all about precision, right? Michael smiled, remembering his own early days in construction. Exactly. Every detail matters. Sarah watched from the porch during her breaks from work, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering uncertainty. But as the days passed, even she began to relax, occasionally bringing out lemonade and sandwiches for the crew. One afternoon, as Michael was helping James measure boards for the new porch, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard Blake. "Board meeting tomorrow. Urgent. Your presence required." Michael stared at the message, feeling the weight of his two worlds colliding. Before he could respond, James's voice pulled him back to the present. "Is everything okay, Mr. Thompson?" Michael looked up, seeing genuine concern in the boy's eyes. In that moment, his decision was clear. He typed a quick reply, "Can't make it. Handling important investment personally." But Richard wasn't so easily dismissed. Later that evening, as the crew was packing up, a sleek black car pulled up to the worksite. Richard Blake stepped out, looking completely out of place in his $1,000 suit. "Michael," he called out, his voice carrying a false warmth. "A word?" Michael tensed, noting how James instinctively moved closer to him. "Richard, this is a surprise." "Indeed." Richard's eyes swept over the construction site, lingering on James. "Quite a project you've taken on here." "It is," Michael agreed firmly. "One that matters." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The board is concerned, Michael. Your priorities seem to have shifted." Maybe they needed to shift. "Be careful," Richard warned softly. "Empires aren't built on charity cases." Before Michael could respond, James stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson isn't doing charity," he said, his young voice steady. "He's teaching me about construction and engineering. It's an investment in the future." Richard's smile turned cold. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said mockingly. "Michael, we need to talk. Privately." As Michael followed Richard to his car, he caught sight of Sarah watching from the window, her face tight with worry. He gave her a reassuring nod, though his own heart was racing. "What do you want, Richard?" Michael demanded once they were alone. "Want? I want you to remember who you are." Richard's voice hardened. "You're Michael Thompson, CEO of Thompson Enterprises. Not some small-town handyman playing father figure to a fatherless boy." The words were calculated to hurt, and they hit their mark. But instead of backing down, Michael felt something strengthen inside him. "Maybe I'm finally remembering who I really am," he said quietly, "not who I became." Richard's eyes narrowed. "The board meeting tomorrow. Be there, or we'll be forced to take protective measures." As Richard drove away, Michael stood in the gathering dusk, his mind racing. He knew Richard well enough to recognize a threat when he heard one. But what could Richard possibly do? The answer came the next morning, and it was worse than Michael could have imagined. As he pulled up to the Carter house, he found Sarah on the porch, her face pale, holding a letter. "They're saying we have to leave," she whispered. "Something about the property being rezoned for commercial development. We have 30 days. Michael felt his blood run cold. The letterhead on the notice bore his company's logo. The battle lines had been drawn, and now Michael had to choose. The empire he'd built, or the family he was growing to love. But as he looked at James's worried face, he realized it wasn't really a choice at all. The real question was, could he fight his own company and win? The Thompson Enterprises boardroom felt different now. Michael sat at his usual place at the head of the table, but the familiar leather chair might as well have been made of thorns. Around him, the faces of his board members, people he'd worked with for years, looked like strangers. Richard Blake stood at the opposite end, a stack of documents in front of him. "As you can see," he was saying, "the Carter property falls within our new development zone. The rezoning application has already been approved." "Approved?" Michael's voice cut through the presentation. "Without my knowledge?" Richard's smile was razor-thin. "You were indisposed. The board voted in your absence." Michael scanned the faces around the table. Some couldn't meet his eyes, while others wore masks of corporate indifference. Only Richard stared back defiantly. "This is about more than just one property," Richard continued. "It's about the future of Thompson Enterprises. Our shareholders, Our shareholders," Michael interrupted, standing slowly, "don't know that we're destroying families to build another shopping mall. Destroying families? Richard laughed. Come now, Michael. We're offering fair market value. More than fair. Actually, the Carters would be better off. Better off? Michael's fist hit the table, making water glasses rattle. You don't know anything about what would make them better off. A tense silence fell over the room. Then Janet Chun, the youngest board member, spoke up hesitantly. Michael, we're worried about you. This personal involvement, it's not like you. Maybe that's the problem, Michael replied quietly. Maybe it's time I became more like me. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder of his own. I've spent the last week reviewing our company's articles of incorporation. Interesting reading, especially the part about the CEO's veto power over property acquisitions. Richard's smile faltered. You wouldn't dare. The shareholders would be interested to know about certain other properties we've acquired, Michael cut in. Properties coincidentally owned by shell companies traced back to board members' relatives. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Michael laid out photographs and documents, watching faces pale as recognition set in. I built this company, Michael continued, his voice steady. I know where all the bodies are buried because I helped bury them, but not anymore. Richard's facade cracked. You're bluffing. You destroy everything you've built? No, Michael replied. I'm rebuilding, starting with stopping this development project. He stood, buttoning his jacket. I'm calling an emergency shareholders meeting. We're going to restructure the board. Anyone who wants to resign before then is welcome to do so. As he turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped him. This is about the boy, isn't it, James? It would be a shame if his mother lost her job at the diner, or if his school suddenly reviewed his scholarship status. Michael turned slowly, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. Threaten them again, Richard, and you'll learn exactly how much power I still have in this town. The drive back to the Carter house was a blur. Michael's hands shook on the steering wheel as the adrenaline wore off. He just risked everything, his company, his reputation, his life's work. But as he pulled up to the house, the sight that greeted him confirmed he'd made the right choice. James was on the porch with Tom, carefully measuring boards for the new railing. Sarah sat nearby, sewing patches on James's school backpack. They looked up as he approached, their faces brightening. Mr. Thompson, James called out. Tom taught me about load-bearing calculations today. That's great, James, Michael managed, his throat tight. Sarah, could we talk? He led her inside and told her everything. The board meeting, the threats, his countermoves. As he spoke, he watched her face shift from fear to anger to determination. Why? She asked when he finished. Why risk so much for us? Michael looked through the window at James, still absorbed in his work with Tom. Because 20 years ago, I forgot something important. Your son helped me remember. What was that? That the measure of a man isn't in what he owns, but in what he builds. Not just buildings, but relationships, trust, hope. He turned to her. I'm not just fixing your house, Sarah. I'm fixing myself. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they saw several black SUVs pulling up to the house. Richard Blake had apparently decided not to wait for the shareholders' meeting. The real battle was about to begin, and it would test not just Michael's power, but the strength of the bonds he'd built with the Carters and the community around them. The black SUVs disgorged a mix of lawyers, corporate security, and city officials. Richard Blake emerged last, wielding a stack of papers like a weapon. The construction crew stopped working, forming a protective line between the newcomers and the house. Tom stepped forward, his weathered face set in stone. This is a private construction site. You're not authorized to be here. Richard ignored him, focusing on Michael, who had emerged from the house. Last chance, Michael. Sign over your voting rights, and this all goes away quietly. Mr. Thompson? James's voice quavered slightly. What's happening? Before Michael could respond, an unexpected voice rang out. What's happening is that these folks picked the wrong neighborhood to bully. Eleanor Martinez, the elderly woman from next door, stood at her fence. Behind her, Other neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. "Mrs. Martinez," Richard began smoothly, "this is a private business matter dash." "Private?" Eleanor scoffed. "Like when your company tried to buy my house last year, or when you threatened the Rodriguez family down the street." More neighbors joined her, and Michael realized with surprise how many faces he recognized from his weeks working on the Carter house. There was Mr. Chun from the corner store, who'd been providing lunch for the crew. The Johnson family, whose kids played with James after school. Pastor Williams from the local church where Sarah volunteered. "This isn't just about one house anymore," Pastor Williams said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "This is about our community." Richard's composure cracked slightly as he noticed several phones recording the confrontation. "We have legal authorization dash." Actually, a new voice interrupted. "You don't?" All heads turned to see Mayor Gloria Rodriguez walking up the street, accompanied by several city council members. "Madam Mayor," Richard sputtered, "we have the rezoning approval dash, which was obtained through questionable means." The mayor cut in. "My office received some very interesting documentation this morning about how that approval was pushed through." Michael kept his face neutral, but inside he smiled. The package he'd sent to the mayor's office had arrived right on time. Furthermore, Mayor Rodriguez continued, "The city council has just voted to designate this entire neighborhood as a historical district, which puts an immediate freeze on any rezoning applications." The crowd of neighbors broke into applause. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This isn't over," he hissed at Michael. "The shareholders dash will be very interested in today's events," Michael finished for him, "especially since several news crews are on their way. I wonder how our stock price will react to videos of Thompson Enterprises trying to intimidate a single mother and her child." As if on cue, the first news van rounded the corner. Richard's security team practically had to drag him back to his SUV. The corporate convoy departed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a celebrating crowd. Sarah stood in stunned silence until James tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, look!" The neighbors were converging on their house, but not to gawk. They came bearing tools, supplies, and food. Mr. Chen's teenage sons started unloading lumber from their father's truck. Pastor Williams had his sleeves rolled up, ready to work. "We've been watching what you've been doing here," Eleanor Martinez explained to Michael. "How you've been helping the Carters. Maybe it's time we all remembered what being neighbors really means." The construction site transformed into an impromptu block party. Tom organized work teams, matching skilled volunteers with tasks they could handle. The sound of hammers and saws mixed with laughter and conversation. Michael found himself working alongside Pastor Williams, installing new windows. "You know," the pastor said quietly, "when you first showed up here, we all thought you were just another rich man trying to ease his conscience." "What changed?" Michael asked. "You did," the pastor replied simply. "Day by day, board by board." As the sun began to set, Sarah called everyone to the backyard where tables had been set up with food contributed by the neighbors. James proudly showed off the new skills he'd learned, explaining construction concepts to anyone who would listen. Michael stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold. Sarah approached, holding 2 plates of food. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, handing him a plate. "I was just thinking about wealth," Michael replied. "I spent my life accumulating money, but this," he gestured at the gathering, "this is real wealth." Sarah's eyes softened. "You know this fight isn't over. Richard won't give up easily." "No," Michael agreed, "but neither will we." As if to emphasize his point, his phone buzzed with a news alert. The first videos of the confrontation had gone viral, and Thompson Enterprises stock was already responding. The shareholders' meeting would be very interesting indeed. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, under the stars, surrounded by the warmth of true community, Michael Thompson finally felt like a wealthy man. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at Thompson Enterprises headquarters, but Michael arrived at 7. The early morning light cast long shadows through the glass and steel building he'd commissioned years ago. Now, its imposing architecture felt less like a monument to success and more like a reminder of what he'd almost become. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since yesterday. The viral videos had sparked a social media firestorm. Hashtag Thompson Takeover and hashtag Save the Carters were trending nationwide. Corporate journalists were digging into Thompson Enterprises' past development projects, uncovering patterns that made Michael wince. But not all the news was bad. "Sir," his assistant Emma rushed up, tablet in hand. "You need to see this." She showed him a live feed from outside. Hundreds of people had gathered in front of the building: construction workers, community members, families from the Carters neighborhood. Many held signs: "People over profit," and "Build communities, not corporations." Among them, Michael spotted Tom and his crew, still in their work clothes. They'd come straight from the Carter house, where work continued despite everything. "There's more," Emma said, swiping to another screen. "Small shareholders have been calling all morning. They're pledging their proxy votes to you. The numbers, they're significant." Michael nodded, straightening his tie. "And the major shareholders?" "Split." The viral videos scared them. Nobody wants to be associated with evicting a single mother and her child. But Richard's been making calls all night, promising higher returns if they stand with him. The elevator ride to the boardroom felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, Michael found himself face-to-face with Janet Chin, the young board member who'd spoken up at the last meeting. "Michael," she said quickly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "I need to tell you something. Richard, he's been moving money. Large amounts. Offshore accounts. I found the records last night." Michael's pulse quickened. "Can you prove it?" Janet handed him a flash drive. "Everything's here. I should have spoken up sooner, but better late than never," Michael assured her. "Thank you." The boardroom was packed. Along with the usual board members and major shareholders, there were lawyers, press, and regulatory officials. Richard sat in Michael's usual seat at the head of the table, a power play that made several people shift uncomfortably. "Shall we begin?" Richard asked, his confidence clearly forced. "We're here to discuss the leadership of Thompson Enterprises and Actually," Michael interrupted, "we're here to discuss its soul." He connected Janet's flash drive to the room's presentation system. "But before we talk about the future, let's look at the past." What followed was 30 minutes of methodically presented evidence. Offshore accounts, shell companies, questionable land deals. With each revelation, Richard's face grew paler. "This is a witch hunt," he finally exploded. "These allegations, are all documented," Michael finished, "and have already been sent to the SEC." A murmur ran through the room. Several shareholders began whispering urgently to their lawyers. "But that's not why we're here," Michael continued, changing the presentation. "This is..." The screen filled with images of the Carter house, before and after photos showing the transformation. Pictures of James learning from Tom, of neighbors working together, of community being built alongside the physical structure. "Thompson Enterprises was founded to build things," Michael said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Somewhere along the way, we forgot what that really means." He clicked to the next slide, a business plan. "I'm proposing a new division, community development and restoration. Instead of tearing down neighborhoods, we'll rebuild them. Instead of displacing families, we'll help them stay and thrive." The room erupted in discussion. Shareholders huddled in groups, calculating potential returns. Lawyers consulted frantically with their clients. Richard stood, his last vestiges of control crumbling. "This is business suicide. You can't The numbers disagree," Michael cut in smoothly. "Our market research shows growing demand for socially responsible development. The publicity from the Carter Project alone has generated more positive brand engagement than our last 5 commercial developments combined." He turned to address the shareholders directly. "We have a choice. We can continue down the path of pure profit, destroying communities in the name of progress. Or we can become a company that builds both buildings and bridges, between people, between neighborhoods, between profit and purpose. The vote," he concluded, "is yours." What followed was 2 hours of intense discussion, negotiations, and finally, voting. When the results were tallied, even Michael was surprised by the margin. Richard was out. The new Community Development Initiative was in. and Michael retained control of the company he'd built, but with a new mandate. As security escorted a protesting Richard from the building, Janet approached Michael. "What happens now?" Michael looked out the window at the crowd still gathered below. "Now? We start building something that matters." His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "James wants to know if you're still coming to help with the roof today?" Michael smiled, already loosening his tie. "Tell him his apprentice foreman is on his way." The empire he'd built wasn't falling. It was transforming, just like he had, one act of kindness at a time. 6 months later, the Carter house stood transformed. Fresh paint gleamed in the autumn sunlight, new windows sparkled, and the rebuilt porch had become a neighborhood gathering spot. But the changes went far beyond the physical structure. Michael stood in what had once been an empty lot next door, now the site of Thompson Enterprises' first community skills center. The building was nearly complete, its modern design harmonizing with the neighborhood's character rather than overwhelming it. "Mr. Thompson," James called, running up with a set of blueprints clutched in his hands. "I think I found a way to make the solar panels more efficient." At 13, James had thrown himself into learning everything he could about sustainable construction. The Skills Center had been his idea, a place where neighborhood youth could learn trades and technology. "Show me," Michael said, spreading the blueprints on a workbench. As James explained his calculations, Michael marveled at how naturally the boy had taken to engineering. Thompson Enterprises had already promised him an internship when he was old enough. Sarah emerged from the Skills Center's front office, where she now worked as the community outreach coordinator. The job had been her idea, not Michael's. She'd insisted on earning her place in the new venture. "The first class registration numbers are in," she announced proudly. "We're already at capacity, with a waiting list." The Skills Center was just the beginning. Similar projects were breaking ground in 3 other cities, each adapted to local community needs. Thompson Enterprises stock had not only recovered but reached new highs as investors recognized the potential in socially responsible development. "Michael," Tom called from across the lot. "Got a minute?" Tom had been promoted to Director of Community Construction, overseeing all the hands-on training programs. He led Michael to where a group of trainees, a mix of young people and career changers, were learning sustainable building techniques. "Remember when you first showed up here?" Tom asked quietly. "If someone had told me then that we'd be standing here today." Michael chuckled. "Life has a way of changing your plans." "Speaking of changes," Tom said, nodding toward the street. A familiar black car was pulling up, but instead of Richard Blake, Janet Chan stepped out, carrying a thick folder. "The final numbers from the first quarter," she reported, now serving as CFO. "The Community Development Division is outperforming projections by 23%. And the goodwill? Priceless." Before Michael could respond, a commotion near the Skills Center caught their attention. Eleanor Martinez was organizing what looked like an impromptu block party, complete with folding tables and home-cooked food. "What's the occasion?" Michael asked as they walked over. "Do we need one?" Eleanor replied with a wink. "Though if you must know, we're celebrating the 100th home repair completed by our neighborhood volunteer corps." The program had started spontaneously after the Carter House project, neighbors helping neighbors fix their homes, with materials and expertise provided by Thompson Enterprises. The ripple effects were visible throughout the community. Rising property values, declining crime rates, strengthening bonds between residents. As the celebration got underway, Michael found himself sitting on the Carter's porch with Sarah, watching James demonstrate basic electrical wiring to a group of fascinated kids. "Sometimes I still can't believe all this," Sarah said softly. "One flat tire changed everything." "Not the flat tire," Michael corrected. "Your son's kindness. That's what changed everything." Sarah smiled. "You know, he talks about running Thompson Enterprises someday. Says he wants to build things that matter." "Smart kid," Michael replied. "Though I'm not planning to retire just yet. Still too much to build." His phone buzzed, another viral video, this time showing the Skills Center's impact. The comments were filled with people asking when similar centers would come to their communities. "We're going to need more help," he mused. "More teachers, more builders, more dreamers." "I'd say we have plenty of those," Sarah said, gesturing to the gathering. The party had grown, drawing people from all over the neighborhood. Former strangers were now friends, sharing food and stories, planning future projects. James bounded up the porch steps, his hard hat still slightly too big despite adjustments. "Mom, Mr. Thompson, come see what we built." As they followed James to his latest project, Michael reflected on how far they'd all come. He'd thought he was helping to rebuild a house, but in truth, they'd built something far more precious. A blueprint for change, a model for how business could serve humanity rather than exploit it. The empire he'd transformed was now building something greater than profit margins and market share. It was building hope, one community at a time. And it had all started with a flat tire and a boy who asked for nothing in return. 1 year to the day after Michael's fateful flat tire, he stood at a podium in front of Thompson Enterprises headquarters. The crowd before him wasn't the usual gathering of shareholders and business reporters. Instead, it was filled with faces he'd come to know over the past year: construction workers, community members, students from the Skills Center, and families whose homes had been restored rather than replaced. "A year ago," Michael began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "I thought I knew what success looked like. I was wrong." He motioned to James, who stood nervously at the side of the stage. "James, would you join me?" The boy, now 14 and notably taller, walked to the podium. His hard hat, finally properly fitted, bore the new company logo. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael continued, "I'm proud to announce the James Carter Scholarship Program. Starting next year, we'll be providing full college scholarships to 50 students annually, focusing on engineering, sustainable development, and community planning." James's eyes widened in surprise. This hadn't been part of the rehearsed speech. "And our first recipient," Michael smiled, "is the young man who taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build." Sarah, watching from the front row, wiped tears from her eyes as James received the scholarship certificate. She was no longer just a waitress, but had become the national director of Thompson's community outreach programs, her innate understanding of community needs proving invaluable. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Michael found himself back where it all began, the stretch of road where his tire had gone flat. They watched as James led a group of Skills Center students past, enthusiastically explaining the solar-powered lighting system they'd installed along the street. "He's going to change the world someday," Sarah said proudly. "He already has," Michael replied. "We all have in our own way." The transformation of Thompson Enterprises had sparked a movement. It was a message from Janet. Their latest community development project had just been approved in Detroit. Another neighborhood would be restored rather than replaced. "You know what I've learned?" Michael said, stopping to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "The strongest foundations aren't built with concrete and steel. They're built with kindness, trust, and the belief that everyone deserves a chance to build something meaningful." Sarah smiled, understanding in her eyes. "And sometimes those foundations start with a flat tire?" "And a boy who asked for nothing in return," Michael added. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the Skills Center, where the celebration continued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to build something that mattered. But tonight was for celebrating how far they'd come and remembering how it all began. As they joined the gathering, Michael caught sight of a young family touring the Skills Center, hope in their eyes as they learned about the programs offered. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in his own reflection the day a flat tire had changed his life. The empire he'd built hadn't fallen. It had grown into something far greater, a legacy of positive change that would continue long after he was gone. And it all started with one simple act of kindness on a quiet street, proving that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single, unexpected step.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.